You can't just do the one thing forever. I can't think of anybody who's done just the one thing and been able to make a lifelong career out of it.
In 1989, an 11-year-old math and music prodigy from Paterson, New Jersey, had an idea. A true product of the 80s, Justin Just Blaze Smith grew up simultaneously obsessed with the decade's two breakthrough innovations, personal computing and hip-hop music. While the two fascinations may have appeared entirely unconnected, Just Blaze knew the first time that he laid eyes on a drum machine that his passion for programming would pay off in rap production. In the 3 decades that would follow, Just would ascend from a burgeoning boom-bap beatmaker to a pioneering architect of Rockefeller Records' signature sound, to eventually breaking out on his own as a musician and songwriter equipped with the virtuosity to jump from penning pop hits in one session to scoring video game soundtracks in another. And today, he stands at the precipice of his next chapter with his role at Brass Lion Entertainment video game studio. And it all started with one idea. How did your parents' professional lives inform your career ambitions?
My mom was an educator. She was an English teacher and then finished her run as the principal of Rosa Parks Fine Arts High School. So if I had to say how her profession informed me, discipline. She instilled code switching very early. She's like, listen, when you're out with your friends and you want to say, word, man, word, you can do that. But there are certain situations where you're going to have to get it refitted. And that was, what she was really just giving me life lessons in terms of just how to move through life and deal with people. My dad was a computer programmer, but his passion was music, playing keys. He played jazz, organ, and piano. So growing up around computers and his programming and growing up around him playing keys, literally informed what I do. You always think you're gonna get in trouble for doing what the adults do, right? Like as a kid, just innately, like I'm probably not supposed to do that. But I would play his keys, and I remember one day, like I'm sitting there just essentially making a beat, not even knowing what making a beat was, right? Like I'm programming drums, I'm playing a bass line, I'm playing keys on it, and I'm thinking that nobody knows. And then I look up and my parents are both like looking through the door, like, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna get in so much trouble. And they're like, no, keep going. People always ask about like the secret to your success, and they always expect some big grand answer. And I'm just like, no. It's the fact that my family was supportive once they realized this talent that I had.
That your dad was a programmer, I sort of can empathize. My dad made video games. He was a programmed video games in the 80s.
Really?
He worked for Sid Meier.
Wow.
But I think about I can't code, but understanding how programming languages work and whatnot for the way the world would bend. I imagine that was probably very consequential for you,
1000%. I started, I guess what we would now call coding, 4th grade. I actually used to write very rudimentary, basic, no pun intended. I used to program in BASIC.
Which is crazy to do before you've taken algebra, to understand the idea of a variable and...
Right, so it's funny, I've never actually thought about this, or now that you mention it. I remember being in 6th grade and the math teacher was like, oh, one day you'll be studying algebra. And here's an example. And she just started asking questions to the class just to kind of gauge to see who might knew what. And I was knocking out the questions left and right. And everybody's looking at me like, oh my God, you're a genius. And I'm like, no, this is just, it's logic.
You also clearly were bit by the hip hop bug at an incredibly young age. 7, 8 years old, you're thinking about getting mixers and DJing and whatnot. Were you looking at it like this is a career path?
I knew that it's what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't think that it would actually be possible. And, as time went on and I'm getting local DJ jobs and, making demos with the kids in the neighborhood, it always just seems like something, it's still just something fun to do.
This is early high school?
Throughout grammar school.
Okay.
I started DJing like actual parties when I was maybe by the time I was like 11.
Oh, wow, okay.
You know, by high school, I'm doing full on like nightclubs, like wild underage, having to be snuck in and out of the DJ booth. Mom sitting outside with the car at 2 a.m. on a school night. But it wasn't until college when I went to Rutgers. I was a kid, I was maybe 16, 17. Like I graduated high school early, so I'm like 16, but in college. There was a nightclub in Newark called The Pipeline, and they would have what they called Fat Funkin' Wednesdays. And it was kind of like a open mic slash, they would have MC battles, they'd have DJ battles, and they were gracious enough to just let me DJ. You would have Tame, L, Red occasionally, Lords of the Underground, Outsiders, Mos Def as well. You know, all these groups that I idolized at the time were all of a sudden like performing like live right in front of me. And like I said, it used to be an open mic thing, and I would just play whatever beats were popular at the time and MCs would run. So eventually I built up the courage to play my own beats, kind of as interludes in between the artists that were performing. And I remember one night, Tame and L, along with the Outsiders, were there. And Z comes up to me, Young Z from the Outsiders, and gives me a copy of his new 12-inch with KRS. It was called Milk. I'm just tripping off the fact that Young Z gave me his record.
Z is a little bit of a superhero, to be fair.
Right, especially in that era. They go to get on stage, and I think I was gonna play Z's instrumental for them to rhyme to, and they were like, nah, put the other beat on. So I'm thinking they want the last record I played. So I play that. They're like, nah, put the beat you were just playing. It was my beat. So like artists that I look up to, who like I said at that point were superheroes, all of a sudden they're asking to rhyme to something that I made, you know, off of a tape. So all of a sudden it's like, oh, maybe this is something I can actually do. Do I have a role model? I have a lot of role models. The first time I looked at somebody and said, I want to be like them when I grow up, was Jam Master Jay. The second, as an adolescent, was Large Professor, who I'm honored to call, you know, a friend and a brother at this point in my life. Only got to meet Jay once, but it still sticks with me to this day.
I do have to ask, how did you graduate high school at 16?
I got skipped a couple times. Nowadays, you see your kid is advanced in certain areas, they just put them in certain classes to support their advancement or certain programs or whatever. Back in the 80s, it was just like, oh, he's a genius. Take him out of kindergarten, put him in 3rd grade. And that's what they did. And I remember my mom came to the school for whatever reason, but it was around the time that I was at recess. And she saw me in the playground with these kids that were like 3 years older. And she was just like, nah, put him back. It's not about the academics. Socially, he's in a different stage in his life and he doesn't know how to interact with kids this age. So they ended up knocking me back like 2 years, but I was still ahead.
When you think about the Rutgers experience, obviously you went in thinking that you were going to walk a sort of straight and narrow path to computer programming. What did you get out of that? And would you do it over knowing that you can land in this other, more creative field?
I say all the time, like, I honestly don't remember one thing that I technically learned at school, and I feel like a lot of us don't, right? What I really learned during my time at Rutgers was just how to deal with people, social skills. I remember at a certain point just being in my classes and being like, I'm wasting my mother's money. Right around that same time is when I got the opportunity to intern at the cutting room. Most of us, right, we go to school and the goal is to get out of school and get a job within a field that you love. This internship lands in my lap and it's like, well, I could go to school for 4 years, and hope to land a job computer programming or doing something in music. But I have an internship right in front of me right now.
When you're thinking about getting this internship to work in a studio, is it in your mind, are you thinking, I'm gonna be a record producer or just sort of any foot in?
In my mind, it was, I am one step closer to being around what I want to do.
Just,
you know what I mean?
Music paying the bills.
Yes, I'm in the environment, Whether I'm a studio manager, whether I'm a producer, whether I'm an audio engineer, whatever it is, I'm here. You know, like my title was general assistant, meaning I might be answering the phones one day, I might be engineering a session for Mobb Deep the next. You know, I might be getting coffee for somebody after that. You know what I mean? It was just whatever I needed to do, I was there. And I got to watch a lot of classic music be made.
What are the qualities within yourself that you have held on to from the beginning to now?
I've held on to a lot of the things that I grew up loving. I have an insane shoe collection. I have a crazy record collection. You know, I have an amazing synthesizer collection. When you start to let go of the things that led you to fall in love with what you do, it's the second you start to become detached from your essence.
So now you're engineering at the cutting room. You have the night manager gig. You fully dropped out of school. Mm-hmm. Are you strategizing on a path forward?
I'm just happy to be there, bro. Soaking up game along the way. Engineers allowing me to sit in on the sessions and learn from them. I don't have a plan.
Are you making music in your downtime?
No, literally, like, you know, the thing I always say, it's super cliche at this point. From 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., I was Justin Smith, assistant studio manager. From 7 p.m. to 9 a.m., I was Just Blaze in training. And I might get an hour of sleep in between. You know, and that's why I have permanent bags under my eyes, because I spent 3 years literally not sleeping. I really had no plan, but funny enough, at a certain point, I was thinking to myself, it might be time to go back to school, because I'm soaking up a lot of game, I'm learning so much, but like nothing's landing. At the same time, I wasn't really pushing for anything to land. It was kind of just one of those things where it was like, all right, I had fun. Let me go back to school. And that same week is when I had a chance meeting with Mase, which led to me doing the Harlem record. Sometimes when you knew that certain artists were working in other rooms, you might leave the door cracked and work on music in the hopes that somebody would walk past and say, hey, what's that? So one night, Mase's management, they were sequencing something. They weren't recording, they were sequencing a sampler tape or something. So I left the door cracked, and sure enough, somebody eventually poked their head and like, yo, what's that? Started playing them music. And it was nothing like what I ended up doing for them. Super Sam was the dude who came in, the homie Sam. Sam, later on that night, is like, yo, so you think we can make a beat out of New Edition Popcorn Love? And I was like, sure. He's like, make that, come to the Hit Factory Thursday. I go to the Hit Factory that Thursday. I play with a bunch of stuff. And Mason's like, yeah, all this is dope, all this is dope. So then Sam's like, yo, play the New Edition beat. So I play that, and Mason immediately starts jumping up and down, like, this is my single. And Sam just looked at me like I told you. 30 days later, I'm watching the video premiere on TV, like still sitting at my job at the cutting room on the couch. That's when I was like, all right, thank God I didn't go back to school, because I was literally about to quit and go back like the week before.
With a hit under his belt and deep knowledge of the studio, Just became known as a producer with an acumen to craft beats tailored to each artist he worked with. His versatility soon caught the ears of the A&R leads at Rockefeller Records, and that union would kick off one of the most legendary collaborative runs in hip-hop history.
You grew up in this sort of boom bap era of hip-hop, and so obviously, you know, I look around your crib, I see the records that are the influences.
Right.
But you come into the game with this very sort of prototypical shiny suit moment. Where were you sort of in terms of feeling like you had found your voice or what you wanted to express through the music?
I actually took pride in the fact that like I could kind of make anything. I grew up on just as much hip hop as I did house and electro and so many other genres of music. So for me, it was just get into where I fit in, and I just happened to be able to fit it in a lot of places. I think that was ultimately a large part of my success. You know, is that when artists would come to me, they never really knew what they were going to get. You know, because a lot of times in that era especially, I would make the beats on the spot. If that didn't work out, I would have a stash to pull from. But it was a lot of it was just very spontaneous, like, all right, how are we feeling today?
Where were you in terms of like, were you all lawyered up and paperwork all taken care of, business
No, but
settled?
so me having grown up hearing so many horror stories about people getting jerked, or also having interned in the studio, right? This is an era of fax machines. I'm seeing recording contracts, that would be sent to the studio, for a producer to look over or sign or whatever, and I would see the production company is getting $50,000 for the song to be produced. The actual producer is getting 10. In that particular era, I got paid for some of the work that I did. Never got what I was fully entitled to, but I got the experience, and that was the most important part, and I got the name out.
One of the things that I've always been sort of impressed by in your career, and I think is unique and extraordinary, is you've always been very conscious about branding. You first came on my radar, obviously, for these first few placements you get, but then the two-way programming of the beats.
So it was like ringtone, basically, it was ringtones before ringtones, right? So a two-way was a device that we used to be able to use to text each other. And there was no such thing as a ringtone back then. It was just, your phone just rang, or your two-way just beeped. But they had a very rudimentary application in them that allowed you to program your own ringtones through a series of, notes and vibrations, like you could program the vibrator. There were a lot of people within the business who first became aware of my name from making two-way ringtones before they even knew me for my actual music.
Where did the name come from?
It came about during the Mase sessions, actually. Super Sam and rest in peace, Huddy Combs, Huddy Six. They were like, "Oh, you got to come up with a name." Like I said, I didn't even have a name. I was just DJ Just, And they're like, "You can't just be Just. Like you got to be something better than that." I think it was Sam was like, "Yo, your name should be Just Hot," and I was like, "I'm not naming myself Just Hot." Hud came in the room a little while later and was like, "Yo, who did that beat?" And they're like, "Over there, homie over there." And he was like, "Oh, that beat is it's just blazing." He didn't even know my name was Just. He was just like, "Oh, that beat is it's blazing." They were like, "That's your name, Just Blaze." And I was like, hell no. But I never came up with a better name. So when the I Really Like It record came out, they put produced by Just Blaze. So I just ran with it. And I was gonna change it. And then the record ended up going gold and doing well. So I just kind of was like, all right, well, kind of be silly to change it now. My biggest advantage as a creator is that I care. And because of that, I studied my craft. And then what I've come to realize over the last 20 plus years is that there are very few of us who actually come from that cloth, whether it's in the studio, whether it's in a boardroom, whether it's in an editing room. I have so many points of reference because I've done nothing but study my craft for the last 40 plus years.
In that sort of period from getting those very first placements until, you got sort of an in-house role with Rockefeller.
Right.
What was the process like back then for a producer shopping beats?
In the beginning, it was like, going to a label, or artist might be in a session and they'd ask you to come by and play some music. But, things took off for me relatively quickly. Like it was a slow beginning, but once things took off, it took off. So I was able to eventually come into a situation where I would get paid before I ever made a beat or went into the studio. You give me the first half, I come into the studio and make something. By the time I got to Rockefeller, from the jump, when G heard my tape from Dino, he reaches out and, he's like, listen, this is a twofold thing. Like, me and hip hop, Hop was the other A&R, Rockefeller, but, me and Hop had this artist Bathgate. We'd love to get you in with him. We also are starting a production team. We had the idea to start a production team for Rockefeller, so we'd love to have you, Rock Wilder, K-Rob, Buck Wild, and Kanye. Jay gave me the beat room at Baseline, and we did a deal off top where it was like, they weren't trying to lock me down. I wasn't trying to be locked down, and I was vocal about that, but they gave me a very large amount of money up front. And what they would basically do is, this number covers this many beats. And that was really the extent of our deal. It was never like a, first right of refusal or whatever. when you have arguably at that point the biggest label in hip hop and some of the best talent, like there doesn't need to be a bunch of protections in place because it's like, Ross, you're gonna go. You know what I mean? Like you're already playing with the winning team. But having the deal structured that way allowed me to go out and still do records with whoever else.
For those first 4 albums, Jay was very pointed in like having very discrete sounds and discrete production teams. And then the dynasty happens and this sort of consortium forms, and it went from being Jay-Z rhymes on what's hot to there's a Rockefeller sound.
Right, we're now dictating the sound and we're dictating what's hot. We started figuring it out on the dynasty, really nailed it on Bean's second album.
A slept-on classic.
And then perfected it on the Blueprint.
And was there a feeling internally once you guys finished the Blueprint, like, this is it?
You never know that you're making history when you're making it. As good as we knew it was kind of like, all right, we got that done, what's next? You know what I mean? So there wasn't really a lot of time for reflection for me personally. And you gotta remember, the Blueprint happens so fast. People always think it's like an urban legend or a myth that the album was done in 3 days, but the vast majority of it was. Jay walked in on a Friday like, Josh, we got some beats, like, you know, I just got a CD from Ye. All right, cool. Like, and he wasn't scheduled to record. So I had nothing in the stash for him. So it was like me going through the hard drive. Girls, 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 the beat had been done. Everybody knows that I made that for Ghostface originally. You Don't Know had been done. The first iteration of it, I don't remember how it came about, but You Don't Know was at one point going to be Busta and Prodigy. A lot of people don't know, like me and P used to hang out a lot. And I still don't have a lot of rap friends, right? Like, P was one of the few. Like, P would actually come to the house, and it was wild because then Al ended up moving around the corner from me. So, You Don't Know had been done, and then I made Song Cry like the second night after Jake finished recording whatever he was recording that day. Lyrical exercise. He kept coming back to it for whatever reason. He would get stuck on the rhyme. So he was like, whatever, scrap it. And the reason it ended up as a bonus is because at the very last minute, he's like, yo, I got the rhyme. Went in and nailed it, but the album was already sequenced and whatnot, but we wanted to use it, so we just tagged it on as a bonus record, yeah.
Was Michael Jackson on Girls, Girls, Girls?
So Michael Jackson is on the Girls, Girls, Girls remix, the Ye version. And I never knew that. I don't know if I didn't go to the studio that day. I thought it was an urban legend or something that Jay said like in jest one day, or just, you know, was some kind of a myth. So one day I was looking for something on the server and I find this straightforward that says MJ vocals. And I'm like, MJ, don't know that, Michael Jackson, whatever. And I'm thinking it's probably stuff from, remember they had the Rock My World?
Yep.
So I'm thinking it's like takes from that session. And I'm like, I don't think they recorded this at Baseline, but let me take a listen and see what it is. And I realize, as I'm listening to it, it's him singing on Girls, Girls, Girls. And I'm like, it's true. Like, I never, all the last 20 years, I found it like during quarantine.
That's great.
So all these years, I'd never known it was actually a real thing. And turns out the files have been sitting downstairs this entire time.
After you guys do Blueprint, and this is when I would say like peak Rockefeller starts, right. And all of a sudden they now have a suite of artists, you have a room in Baseline, and you're churning out records at an extremely high volume. What was your life like in that moment?
What was my life like during that time? Hectic.
Are you sleeping in the studio? Are you going home?
I'm really not sleeping, because at this point, Baseline is legit a factory, right? So everybody has their times in which they work, right? So like Bleak is an early bird, right? So he's at the studio by like 11 a.m. Hove is getting there 1:30, 2 o'clock-ish. Once you get to the era where Dipset's around, they're getting there around 7. Beans is getting there at 4 in the morning after telling you that he was on his way at 8 p.m., passing out, and then waking up at 6 a.m. like, let's go. You know what I mean? So it was me holding down a lot of the production duties for all these artists. There really was no time for anything else, in between. But yeah, like me, Goo, Hop, Shane, Dave, like we basically lived at Baseline.
And so that was, I would imagine, a very intense 2 or 3 years that this is going on.
Yeah.
What was the wind down like? The sort of rupture in the relationship with Dame and Jay is well documented at this point.
Right.
But being in the middle of that as it's happening, what is that energy like, and how cognizant of these changes are you sort of day to day, week to week?
You could definitely see the change in the energy. You could see the change in the dynamic. There were all of a sudden a lot more closed door meetings than there ever used to be. There's a lot of things that I've never spoken on and I wouldn't, but I remember when a line was drawn for me, like personally, at one point, me and Dame had like an actual issue. And Jay got wind of what was happening and, pulled me to the side and asked me what was going on. So I told him, and that conversation is when I actually understood, oh yeah, this is about to be over. I remember one of the last conversations that we had as a group. It was the day that Ye brought Kwali's Just to Get By over. We were doing a photo shoot. I forget what the shoot was for. But this was kind of like my last fond memory of Rockefeller as a unit. That was the first time. And they brought it to me, like, should we do a Just Blaze Rockefeller album? And I was the one that was like, I was always leery about that. Like, I was always a little, I guess, insecure about being put on Front Street like that, or being a front man of something. Like, I was cool playing the majority, the background. But they were like, nah, like, you're like our Dr. Dre. We need, Dr. Dre got to where he got to by making his albums. Like, he did NWA and all that, then he went and did the Chronic. You got to do your Chronic. So let's figure that out. And I was just like, all right, cool. And shortly after that, when everything fell apart.
It's crazy because it's such a definitive and iconic moment in hip hop, but it really was like 24 months or 28 months,
right? It feels either much larger or much longer than it actually was, like, in actual time. There was so much more work to do. There was so much more that could have been done.
After the fracturing of Rockefeller Records, Just set out on his own, operating Baseline Studios and working closely with emerging artists like Saigon and Jay Electronica. And in the 20-teens, his career would come full circle, helping lead the overdue diversification of the video game industry.
With Rockefeller sort of dissolving, it puts you in an interesting sort of moment of inflection in your career. You are well established with dozens of classic records under your belt, fairly secure financially, I would imagine at that.
Right.
Did you have a game plan or a strategy for what was going to come next?
No, I had some ideas, but I didn't have an actual straight up game plan. Like, by that point, I'd owned Baseline, right? So it was like, all right, we own the studio. The problem with that is everybody views Baseline as a private space, right? Because Rockefeller basically had it locked down for years. It was never really on the radar of labels because people just assumed, well, you can't book Baseline, and it took me a long time to be like, no, actually you can. And then, I was still very busy, producing, obviously. But that, I think for me, the next phase was like, all right, cool, well, let's try, I guess, do a label or do some kind of a, let's find some artists or something, which leads to the Saigon era. And doing that deal with Atlantic, because once Rockefeller was over, G and Hop went to Atlantic, so that was the easy, the alley-oop, like, whoever else I was producing for at the time, like Saigon became the big focus for a while. And obviously that went the way that it went.
I was gonna say, it felt like in that period, there was a real aspiration on your part to make a body of work with someone. And it kind of, between Saigon and Jay Elec, back to back for a litany of unconnected and random reasons.
Right.
Neither sort of congealed into what one got the feeling you were aspiring toward.
I was never really looking to make a body of work per se.
Okay.
But I understand why you would say that. Because a lot of people would feel like, oh, the only reason Just isn't mentioned in the same breath as certain other producers is because he hasn't made a total body of work. And I'm like, the amount of work that I have done in so many albums where I was a large part or the anchor of the album, a lot of that work was so good. I'm like, I'm not really worried about it. Like, I don't have to be the start to finish guy. When it came to working at Baseline, you know, one of the rules was you check your ego at the door. Jay's thing was always, we do what's best for the record. There's uncredited overdubs on so many records, you know, like there's records on the Blueprint that were touched by other producers, you know, like that aren't credited. It was just, this is what the record needed. Even on records that I didn't technically produce, Jay would be like, yo, I need this to sound like this, just can you do that or add that, right? Or the majority of Freeway's album was really just B, Goo, and Freeway in the room. Like, and you know, even on records that I didn't produce, like I'm still working on the mix, or I'm still picking beats with Free. There's a whole other cast of characters that people don't even know played a part. So like being the sole producer on an album was never so much a concern for me as it was like, what is the end result? What's best for the record? You know, as Jay always used to say.
In that era, also, sounds start to shift. The sort of gravity of hip hop moves to the South a bit.
Right.
And how did your relationship with the music start to change? As a kid who grew up obsessed with it, and then you get to be in it, and then you get to be at the heart of the most exciting thing that's happening.
Right.
Did your ambition or the thing that make you happy about it start to shift in that period?
I was always very cognizant of the fact that it could all be over tomorrow, right? So at a certain point, it was just like, okay, the name is established, the history is there, the discography is there. How do we start to leverage this outside of sitting in a studio 20 hours a day making music, because that's not always gonna be feasible. That's what led me to start doing like scoring work, you know, like a bunch of the game scores that I did. It was just, you know, from a financial standpoint, I made more money doing like 1 or 2 games.
Which games did you do?
So I did NBA Street Volume 2, which is widely considered, you know, a classic of that era. I also did NBA Live 2003, which was EA Sports Comeback. And then because I was in the EA Sports ecosystem, I would allow them to relicense things for other titles, so like Madden, MLB, Tiger Woods, etc. Fast forward a bit later, Street Fighter 4, I did all the scoring for the commercials. Same for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Out of the Shadows.
Was that work creatively exciting? Was it a fun challenge?
It was definitely exciting because it's like, now you're not operating within the confines of bars, hooks, versus it's just how do we take what's happening on screen and amplify it, you know, or make it that much more exciting. How do we allow the visual to inform the audio, right? Because most times when you're dealing with music or making records, for the most part, the visual is the last part. In this case, the things are being created in tandem. So as they're building the game, I'm watching it and I'm getting advanced copies of it and, you know, scoring to picture basically. It was definitely a fun exercise, but more importantly, it kind of was my first real exposure to controlling your brand and positioning myself in a medium outside of what I was known for. You can't just do the one thing forever. You know, I can't think of anybody who's done just the one thing forever and been able to make a lifelong career out of it.
One of the more interesting things that you did in that period, probably the highest quality piece of branded content ever in Exhibit A.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was... Guitar Center wanted to do a partnership. They wanted to give us the cover of the circular for that season. And they were like, hey, listen, why don't you guys do a record and we'll sponsor it and pay for it. We'll pay for all the expenses. And all right, great, no problem. There wasn't a big money exchange. It was just like, we will give you any piece of gear that you would ever want that is out right now. Which me being a gear nerd was amazing. Then we did the record, and the only way you could actually physically get it is if you went to Guitar Center, and I don't even think you had to buy something. I think you would just walk in and there would be like, the CDs would just be sitting at the cashier. Things we do sometimes without even trying can be so impactful. I mean, it was kind of the same story with Exhibit C. That was supposed to just be a promo for Angela Yee, and it ended up becoming a cultural phenomenon. What does money mean to me? Doesn't mean happiness, I can tell you that much. Other than that, not really sure. But it doesn't buy you happiness.
As you're sort of thinking about creating alternate revenue streams and also setting yourself up even outside of your sort of core craft,
right,
music, what was your journey of discovery into entrepreneurship, and what were the first moves that you made?
I think one of the very first things was like, as artists, as creators, we don't have 401ks, we don't have retirement funds, we don't have pensions, we work for ourselves, right? So when I was living downtown, one of my neighbors who lived like the floor down from me was a junior account executive at Morgan Stanley, and even as a junior at the time, like, he wasn't taking on accounts that were less than $500,000, which I didn't have at that moment, right? But I had like 60, and he was able to take me on and, kind of just like show me the ropes of investment, creating your own retirement, plans and IRAs and things of that nature, and kind of put me on the path to like, it's cool to have money and it's cool to save money, but save it in ways that make money for you in that regard. And then just even being around Jay, who is like one of rap's serial entrepreneurs, you know what I mean? Like early on, and like watching like the formation of the 40/40 Club even, right? As they're going through the blueprints and designing the space and, dealing with contractors and whatnot. I've always been around, I've been fortunate to be around so much of that. And have people who would just freely offer advice. But I think in terms of like concrete things or physical establishment, it probably wasn't until we did the Ani Ramen restaurants.
That is a tough business.
Yeah, and especially going through the COVID era, and through lockdowns and shutdowns and whatnot, we were able to pivot to a nonprofit. That's what helped us get through that. We gave away, I don't know how many tens of thousands of meals. Well, because at first, you gotta shut the restaurant down, but you have a zillion refrigerators full of food, it's gonna go bad. So it's just like, turn the lemons to lemonade, and we just started feeding local families and people who were affected by, the virus. But that community outreach and effort is what allowed us to, stay open and weather that storm. Yeah, so it's been amazing, it's been great, it's been profitable at this point. You hear some of these stories of people who invest in a restaurant and never get anything back, or have to wait 10 years to turn a profit. Like we made our money back within the first 2-3 years, which was amazing. You don't see that too often.
Your most recent venture, which I know is still sort of somewhat under wraps,
right,
is kind of the confluence of your entire life's experience.
Indeed. I'm working very closely with Brass Line Entertainment. In 2017-18, it was just an idea to start a video game studio that represented storytelling, or was focused on storytelling from Black and brown voices and just marginalized groups in general. We are at a 59 staff full-time.
So nearly 60 employees.
Yeah. A lot of companies talk the diversity talk. Very few of them walk it, right? So there'll be a bunch of Black and brown voices down here, or underrepresented voices down here, but then you get further up the food chain, they're not there. They're not making the decisions, they're not cutting the checks. But we wanted to be able to tell our stories in an interactive medium. And like you said, it's kind of like the culmination of a lot of things within my life. I get to live in the tech space, which has been in my DNA from the time I was literally a kid, with making video games from when I was in grammar school, creating music and creating it for ourselves. What I mean by that is, Like I said, I worked on a lot of game titles, right? But it was always for somebody else, for somebody else's IP, somebody else's property. Yeah, I got paid, but it wasn't mine. It's going to be something that is very much all of ours.